I am proud to introduce our own Bob Conway, who achieved fame in the class of 1967 as the co-organizer of the first intercollegiate skateboard championship with Burke Moody. Absolutely. And who also was one of our most valued members of the swim team. He, like so many of our classmates who took introductory art
welcome everybody
at Williams, was drawn into the world of Lane Faison and Whitney Stoddard, a world that engaged his psyche so that he, like so many of us and so many of our illustrious alums, has emerged as a force in the American art world. Bob started and finished Williams as an English literature major with honors, but was really engaged in the art history, and he took more and more courses. And at the end of graduation, he signed up and became a Clark Art Institute, Williams College special student in art history the next year. So he stayed in Williamstown for another year. Bob then went into the Peace Corps in Libya to teach English for 2 years. And when he returned home, he worked with at-risk youth. But the art world just pulled him in. And he went back to Princeton to get his MA in art history. And after finishing Princeton, he entered the New York art gallery scene and spent many years there, becoming first the director of the David Tunick Gallery and then the director of Associated American Artists, growing both galleries extensively during his tenure. Hailing originally from California, in 1991, he moved back to Oakland and became an independent art dealer and art historian. As a dealer, he placed works of art in public collections in many of the major museums in the United States and abroad, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Portrait Gallery, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, as well as many college art museums. As an art historian, he's been involved in writing articles and catalogs for major art exhibits. Many years were spent preparing and helping to create a number of George Bellows exhibits for the National Gallery of Art, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Royal Academy in London, and for the Frick Art and Historical Center. Bob's project brought a great appreciation for the works of Bellows throughout the art world. And for us in our San Francisco event, when his passion for art, and particularly for Bellows art, made us feel as if we were back among the Williams giants. While working on Bellows, he also prepared After the Ruins, re-photographing the San Francisco earthquake and fire for the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, and was the winner of the Communication Arts Interaction Design annual competition for informational design. In 2009, he became the director of the Connors Family Trust in San Francisco, a position he presently holds. He did not know Bruce Connors, nor Bruce Connors' wife, but through a mutual friend, became the person to direct the Connors art. Bruce Connors, 1933 to 2008, although known regionally in San Francisco, Bob saw, and as well as others, that he was one of the foremost American artists of the post-war era. His work touched on a variety of themes of post-war American society, from a rising consumer culture to the dread of nuclear apocalypse. He put together exhibits, the first in smaller museums and around the country. He also took this huge body of work, of multimedia work, that needed to be sorted out through cataloging, and had a database created so that really the exhibits and the information on Connors was to be there in the art world. In the smaller museums, first he started with the exhibits in the smaller museums around the country, and then over the last 3 years he's been working with 7 curators for a retrospective. And last year, and this year, the retrospective appeared in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Museum National Centro del Arte in Madrid, entitled Bruce Connors, It's All True. Bringing his sounds good for the time. Bringing as promised the international appreciation that Bob had envisioned Bruce Connors deserved. Bob won the Daedalus Foundation Exhibit Catalog Award this year for that catalog of the show. But he is not done. His next task is to take Gene Connors, who is an artist as well, into the world of understanding and knowledge. Bob's writing skills, his management skills, his vision, and his understanding of art history sets him apart. And I know he would make Lane Faison and Whitney Stoddard proud. We're honored to have him speak with us today on the topic of the artist and society, weaving, wearing, and removing the emperor's new clothes. We started with a different title, but this is a nice one to have. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming this morning. It's quite an experience being here for a 50th reunion. I hope you all get to have that experience down the line. And it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I don't expect to be here for my 100th. But anyway, thanks for being here. And John, thank you so much for that introduction and for your invitation to represent our class. It's an honor, and it has proven to be quite a challenge as well. When our class reunion committee asked me to talk about the artist and society, I started searching for a conceptual framework that I could use to organize such an impossibly vast topic. I read poetry, philosophy, theory, criticism. Most were useful, but none was what I wanted. Finally, I chose Hans Christian Andersen's mid-19th century story, The Emperor's New Clothes. I picked it for 3 reasons. First, it's a cynical tale of fraud, vanity, and mass delusion, quite fitting to our present cultural and political condition. It's a glib way to dismiss what seems empty and phony, and I use The Emperor's New Clothes to label aspects of the world, especially the art world, that I don't understand or approve of. I'd like to stop doing that. I'd like to start taking a more generous approach, not abandoning my opinions of what I like and don't like, but approaching what any artist is trying to do with respect and with anticipation of what I might learn from his or her sincere efforts. Second, if we strip the story of the element of deceit, we end up with a concise template of how artists and societies interact. Turn the con artist weavers into genuine artists creating objects of great beauty. Turn the clothes horse emperor into a client wanting to project a positive image and willing to pay for it. Turn the court and the town into an audience receptive to their leader's message of dignity and authority. And we've got a model of how Western artists and societies have interacted for roughly 3,000 years. A stable working relationship between artist, patron, and audience. But how does the young boy, the truth teller at the end of the story, fit into my template? I'll take what the boy represents at the end of the story and put it at the beginning, into the hands of the artist, in whose creations we hope to find not only beauty, but also truth. But what kind of truth? Not just accuracy of representation. That's only a point of departure long since left behind in the history of Western art. More like emotional and psychological truth that speaks to an audience regardless of the geographical, cultural, and temporal distances separating the point of creation from the point of encounter. The work I'm showing this morning succeeds on both counts, objects of great beauty and personal yet universal truth that endure far removed from their original contexts. The third reason is that both Andersen's story and art itself depend upon the power of illusion. We know that a picture of something is not the thing itself, but a skillful or even a simply suggestive rendition of reality can be so convincing that we easily blur the boundary between the physical object and what it represents. As Magritte said, the famous pipe. How people reproached me for it, and yet, could you stuff my pipe? No, it's just a representation, is it not? So if I had written on my picture, "This is a pipe," yeah, I would have been lying. I don't mean to reduce art to visual trickery, rather to elevate it to visual alchemy. Take this drawing by V. S. Elmans, in which she uses mundane materials to evoke wind and sunlight on water. Water, wind, and light are not made of graphite, acrylic, and paper, yet we have no trouble accepting her drawing as a true representation of the ocean. We take the artist's ability to do this for granted, and I suggest that we shouldn't. Next time you're in a museum, ignore the wall label, and if the guard's not looking, get as close to the work as you can. Too close to make sense of the composition. Look at its surface. Look at the actual stuff it's made of, and marvel at how the artist transformed this stuff into art. In the traditional relationship between artist, patron, and society, the patron is in control. Coming onto the screen is a sampler of patron-centric artworks, commissioned by princes of state and church, leaders of commerce and class, to assert their power, legitimacy, wealth, and status. This relationship has worked successfully for millennia because it's never static. It fluctuates. It reflects the circumstances of its surroundings and adjusts as needed. As political, religious, and economic systems evolve, the nature of the relationship between the three roles changes. Over time, its evolution tends towards enlarging the membership within each group, removing barriers between them, and increasing their interaction. We're all familiar with the most important results of these changes. The definition of professional artist expanded beyond Caucasian men to include women and people of color. As great as the history of Western art may be, its past, present, and future are enriched beyond measure by the inclusion of more than half the world's potential population of artists. Patronage expanded beyond the ruling classes to include the middle class, creating a demand for a new group of professionals to attend to the needs of a much larger population. Art dealers, educators and curators, and collectors and critics, all of whom can function as influential patrons in their own right. The composition of the audience, that's us, expanded beyond court and congregation to include all of us. As palaces became noble estates, and museums and royal collections became national collections. Finally, improvements in reproductive methods allowed us to experience in facsimile artworks we would never have the opportunity to see in person. Digital reproduction has accelerated this process by an incalculable factor, and we're only beginning to understand the effects of instantaneous global access and dissemination of images. One already in play is social media saturation, as these two controversies that occurred this spring in New York demonstrate. Now let's take a closer look at the evolution of the relationship between artist, patron, and audience in specific works of art. The statue of the Emperor Augustus was discovered on the site of the suburban Villa Primaporta, where his widow lived after his death. It presents him as an idealized leader, confident, determined, ageless. His armor identifies him as Imperator, commander-in-chief of the armies. The figures on his breastplate recount one of his diplomatic victories. Hanging off his right leg is Cupid, the son of Venus, riding a dolphin, her patron animal. Augustus's adopted father, Julius Caesar, claimed he was descended from the goddess. The sculptor's message is clear. Augustus rules not only on the merits of his success as a leader in war and peace, but also in his connection to the divine Julius and to Venus herself. A connection reinforced by his being shown barefoot, an attribute normally reserved for gods. This is a cultured, refined form of propaganda. David's painting of the Emperor Napoleon conveys the same message. Napoleon is shown in the spring of 1800, leading his army over the St. Bernard Pass into Italy to defeat the armies of Austria. Like Augustus, he points the way forward to victory, and like the anonymous Roman sculptor, David includes references to his heroic predecessors, Hannibal and Charlemagne, who also led armies across the Alps. In the foreground, David renders their names as if carved into stone. Separated by 17 centuries, these two proclamations of imperial authority are deliberately consistent. David clearly understood the long tradition he was invoking, and his command of that tradition was so successful that Napoleon ordered 3 more versions of the painting. Whether their power is temporal or spiritual, the traditional game is the same: artists working in the service of patrons. We know nothing about Master Consolus other than he inscribed this fresco as his work. He depicts Innocent III presenting a proclamation granting new revenues to the Brotherhood of Monks. This pope, trained by Benedictines, would naturally bestow favor on a monastery dedicated to their patron saint, and just as naturally, the community would hire an artist to commemorate his patronage. Consolus's skill as a painter limits his representation to a mostly symbolic one. The Pope's generalized features are no more expressive of his authority than his robe and papal tiara, and may be less interesting to the viewer than the text of his proclamation. By the middle of the 17th century, artists had long since mastered the craft of creating convincing illusions of volume and texture. More important, masters like Velázquez could generate a compelling illusion of personality. Here, a keen, impatient intelligence directed at the painter and, by extension, at us. While this portrait is nominally about the Pope, by conjuring a personality so vividly, the artist has infused the painting with a palpable sense of his own genius, a sense that has far outlasted the legacy of the individual he was paid to commemorate. Velázquez's painting is one of the many high points in the history of artists supporting traditional patriarchy. Marie Vieille's is an early moment in the counter-assertion of gender equality. She painted during the short-lived First French Republic. During the previous decade of revolution, the monarchy and the church had been overthrown. L'École des Beaux-Arts, the main arbiter of contemporary art, had been opened to women, as had the Louvre, the former royal palace now partially converted into a public museum. The artist's studios on the floor below the museum wing of the Louvre had also been opened to women, and that's what we see here: a portrait of a young, fashionably dressed art student working in one of those studios. It was commissioned by her parents and hung in the family home, which is visible through the window across the Seine and behind the embankment. The couple standing in front of her house may be a double portrait of Marie Josephine and an admirer, signaling to a contemporary audience the radical concept that women could lead respectable personal and professional lives simultaneously. Sterling Clark's gift to freshman fantasies of yesteryear it always seemed a bit silly to me. But for my purpose today, it is another example of stunningly proficient technique, as well as a reminder that society has a way of resisting change. Notwithstanding the feminist achievements of the First Republic at the beginning of the century, nor the radical challenge of Impressionism since mid-century, this conventionally classicized painting was accepted into the Salon of 1873. 2 years later, this painting was not. Bouguereau's Sylvan Fantasy is based on a first-century Latin poem about Pan chasing Daphne. The nymph escapes his pursuit by jumping into the pond, where she is safe because satyrs can't swim. The Clark painting is a comic follow-up to the poem, a sort of revenge of the nymphs. Mythological satyrs and nymphs represented male and female sexuality unconstrained by social norms. Because this painting wears a veil of classical illusion, its coy eroticism was socially acceptable. Caillebot's painting of urban laborers was not. It was criticized for its, quote, vulgar subject matter, which I take to mean it treated openly a truth of everyday life. If institutions of patronage lag behind, what should the artist do? Caillebot moved on. 2 years later, he showed this painting in the Second Impressionist exhibition and then put it up for auction. It failed to sell and remained in his collection until after his death, when his executor, Auguste Renoir, donated it to the National Collection. Bouguereau played by the rules. He got into the salon and quickly sold his painting to an American collector. At this point, I'm tempted to render judgment and label this a textbook case of the emperor's new clothes. Verdict: the Clark painting is a frivolous excuse to exploit naked young women, while the Paris painting is a sincere effort to ennoble semi-naked young men. Traditional artist wins, progressive artist loses. But whatever the intention of each artist and the merits of each painting, pitting them against each other distorts both. Both artists trained at the Academy. Both created carefully composed, beautifully painted pictures. And both in different ways reveal some socially relevant truth. Caillebotte is direct. Mundane activity is a legitimate subject of fine art. Bouguereau is sly. To discover how, look past the flesh to the satyr. His left hoof is already well into the water. The other is about to slip down the bank. He never mated with Daphne, and now he's about to be thrown by her girlfriends into the equivalent of a cold shower. The females win, the male is humiliated twice over. Many of you will remember the controversy surrounding Chrysophili's painting hanging in the Brooklyn Museum during the 1999 Sensations exhibition. Then New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani threatened to terminate the museum's lease for showing what he called sick stuff. His complaint focused on a glob of varnished elephant dung stuck to the Virgin's uncovered right breast. As often is the case with self-appointed censors, the mayor missed the much greater offense of the collages of female anatomy cut from pornographic magazines, floating across the surface of the painting as genuinely profane allusions to heavenly putti. Apart from the central and very important argument about government interference infringing on civil liberties, there are two other issues to consider here. The first being the familiar elephant in the room. Is this painting offensive because of the dung, or because Ophelia, a British citizen of Nigerian heritage, portrayed the Virgin as not only black, but with exaggerated African facial features? The second concerns conflict of interest. The Brooklyn Museum hyped the show before it opened, and then profited from the ensuing controversy and the record number of visitors it stimulated. The sponsor of the show, British advertising magnate and mega collector Charles Saatchi, profited from the attention directed toward the exhibition of his collection. After it closed, he sold a group of works by artists in the show at auction for several $1 million, promising to donate the proceeds to art school scholarship funds. But only 3% of that total was actually given to the schools, and the rest went to commissioning new work for his gallery. Translating all of this into terms of my topic, we have a mix of provocative artistic expression, self-serving patronage, political opportunism, and audience manipulation. A decade after the Sensations battle, the struggle over these issues continues. An artist's provocation, a museum's exhibition, and an audience's intense reaction, now debated instantaneously and globally via social media. This year's Whitney Biennial exhibition has at its themes, quote, the formation of self and the individual's place in a turbulent society. As Roberta Smith wrote in her New York Times review, the show announces a new chapter of so-called political art. Many of these artists confront such American realities as income equality, homelessness, misogyny, immigration, violence, hatred and biases of race, religion, and class. But they are equally committed to the artistic exploration of media and materials and to the creation of bold and strange things to see and think about. One of the bold and strange things in the show is Dana Schutz's painting of the mutilated Emmett Till, based on the 1955 photograph of his casket left open by his mother so all could witness the violence suffered by her son. A few days after the show opened, an African-British woman, Hannah Black, herself an artist, issued an open letter to the Whitney curators objecting to the appropriation of black history by a non-black artist. Secondary media accounts focused on her recommendation, quote, that the painting be destroyed and not entered into any market or museum, end quote, which was the most contentious item of what I found to be an otherwise eloquent and impassioned statement. In her own words, quote, these non-black artists who sincerely wish to highlight the shameful nature of white violence should first of all stop treating black paint as raw material. Through his mother's courage, Till was made available to black people as an inspiration and warning. Non-black people must accept that they will never embody and cannot understand this gesture. The evidence of their collective lack of understanding is that black people go on dying at the hands of white supremacists, that black communities go on living in desperate poverty not far from the museum where this valuable painting hangs, that black children are still denied childhood. In an interview a few days later, Ms. Schutz responded with equal passion and eloquence, and I quote her, I made this painting in August of 2016, after a summer that felt like a state of emergency. There were constant mass shootings, racist rallies filled with hate speech, and an escalating number of camera phone videos of innocent black men being shot by police. The photograph of Emmett Till felt analogous to the time. What was hidden was now revealed. The anger surrounding this painting is real, and I understand that. It's a problematic painting, and I knew that getting into it. Is that for me? Let's get back to Dana here. I do think that it's better to try to engage something extremely uncomfortable, maybe impossible, and fail than to not respond at all. End quote. I can't imagine a more succinct statement of the artist's role in today's society that it is better to try to engage and fail than not respond at all. Nor can I characterize the response of an engaged audience better than Hannah Black has. And I should point out the progress of the museum as patron beyond its traditional role of keeper of the art, knowledge, and truth, to a new role as mediator, encouraging all of us to work through this in the public forum that they provide. Now let's look at a few examples of artists exceeding the expectations and limitations of patron and audience. By weaving the emperor's new clothes, I mean creating a visual vocabulary so successful in fulfilling one patron's agenda that it continues to work as a solution for countless other patrons far into the future, even though they operate in circumstances very different from the original. Although it has a low, relatively unimpressive profile in the surrounding neighborhood, the Pantheon encloses one of the most impressive interior spaces I've ever experienced. Today, still the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome, just under 50 yards in circumference and the same in height, a perfect sphere set within a perfect drum. The first time I walked through the darkness of the entry into this vast space, I became disoriented and had to move from the center to the perimeter so I could touch the wall and regain a manageable sense of scale. Much later, I learned that my reaction was intended, as the sanctuary was designed to evoke the dome of heaven. So I climbed up through the double walls of the drum onto the rim of the dome and then out to the edge of the oculus, 30 feet across with 140 feet of nothing between me and the floor. At that point, I understood the magnitude of what this ancient architect had accomplished, and I also understood that I better get down from there. It was starting to rain, and it was slippery. But the Pantheon is more than a spatial wonder, and more than the marvel of engineering required to create such a space. It is also a striking political statement, a perfect synthesis of a radical innovation and antique tradition made by joining circle, rectangle, and triangle, the drum, the antechamber, and the portico. A triangular pediment atop a colonnade had been the ubiquitous style of temple architecture in the classical world for at least 5.5 centuries. It would be instantly recognizable to anyone as the way temples should look. Seen from street level, the pediment blocks our view of the dome behind it, giving no hint of the surprise that awaits us within. But it gives us more than a hint, of Hadrian's dynastic ambition. Hadrian's family came from Roman Spain. He was not a part of the Julio-Claudian succession that had dominated the first century of imperial rule from Julius Caesar to Nero. Despite the dismal end of the family's rule, it would be to his advantage to suggest a connection between himself and Augustus, the first emperor in that line. Do I need to translate the caption, the inscription? Or did you all take Latin here? It reads, Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, consul for the third term, made this. But who's Agrippa? Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa was patron of the first version of the Pantheon and an extremely important aide to Augustus, instrumental in defeating his chief rivals for power, Pompey and Antony, and responsible for maintaining the public works of Rome, thus his patronage of the first version of the Pantheon. By rebuilding the Pantheon under the name of the original Augustan sponsor, Hadrian, behind a facade of modesty, connected his patronage to the origins of the empire and gave to Rome an architectural masterpiece, the likes of which no one had ever seen before. But the Pantheon's combination of formal and political genius has kept it in the public eye ever since. Country gentleman and polymath Thomas Jefferson used it as the model for both his home and his university. So it isn't surprising that Secretary of State Jefferson judged William Thornton's design for the Capitol building, quote, simple, noble, beautiful, excellently distributed. I'm not sure that oversized gazebo behind the dome is excellently distributed, but in any case, it was never built. The slow pace of construction, plus the British burning the building in 1814, led to a new design by Thomas Walter, the fourth architect to work on the project. He based his design of the dome on the Invalides in Paris, which he himself had seen as a young man. And this dome, which shelters the tomb of Napoleon, was derived from the final design of St. Peter's. Although Michelangelo altered the original proportions almost beyond recognition, he retained the three basic elements of the ancient Pantheon: portico, antechamber, and rotunda. If you live in one of the 44 states, other than New York, New Jersey, Louisiana, North Dakota, Alaska, or Hawaii, your state government works in a provincial knockoff of a federal design that started out as a pagan temple, moved through countless Italian Baroque churches to the tomb of a French tyrant and the plantation of a Virginia patriot. I wonder whether some part of government's low approval ratings might be due to an outdated, overworked architecture. Public symbolism is important, and we haven't yet come up with a new architectural model for projecting a message of civic engagement and pride. But not for lack of trying by some very fine architects. The overriding message of these designs is big. Not much civic inspiration, no allusion to higher values, just a repetition of modules suggesting the vast bureaucracies within. To be sure, the recently opened and criticized NATO Headquarters in Brussels is big, repetitive, and full of bureaucrats. Yet it could serve as an example of a new form of civic symbolism, not in the 8 interlaced fingers that are supposed to suggest two hands joined in cooperation, symbolic of Allied unity. You can't get this message unless you approach by helicopter. I'm thinking about what's inside, a network of windows, blinds, and recycling systems intended to minimize the consumption of energy for heating, cooling, lighting, and water use. This is a message of sustainability, the contemporary equivalent of the message of stability that governments have usually broadcast through references to the classical past. Instead of looking back in time, buildings like this prepare for the future. When I coined the expression wearing the emperor's new clothes, I was thinking about celebrity and the potentially negative influence of fame and fortune upon artistic integrity. I thought that self-portraiture would automatically reflect self-regard, and as a private genre of art that doesn't depend upon patron and audience, it might also be a good test of my template. I picked an easy target, Rembrandt, who in his 50-year career created over 90 self-portraits. But my assumption about celebrity was a bit off the mark. His self-portraits as a young man dressed in exotic costumes are less about ego than about marketing. Half-length portraits were an established genre in 17th century Holland, and paintings like this one, done when he was 30, were popular and saleable vehicles for advertising his superb technique, a way to promote his brand more than his personality. Early Warhol portraits, this one done when he was 38, had the same intent. Celebrity was certainly central to his art and life, but I think this picture is, like Rembrandt's, about product. By painting himself in his trademark silkscreen style, he is promoting his unique line of pop portraiture. As they aged, their priorities changed. Rembrandt and Warhol painted these near the ends of their lives, when both were well beyond caring about their careers. Celebrity has yielded to mortality, self-promotion to self-reflection. These are sober, thoughtful, vulnerable works. As I age, they become, for me, increasingly meaningful. Another 30-something self-portrait, done just after Kirchner was granted leave from the German army. Far from the front lines, he nevertheless suffered a nervous breakdown, and his sympathetic commanding officer sent him home. It's a hallucinatory portrait. His extreme physical appearance expresses his extreme psychological state. A fear of being wounded in battle so vivid that he imagines losing his right hand, and thereby losing his professional and, metaphorically, his personal potency. Fear of losing potency was also in the mind of the 26-year-old Picasso. Not from combat, but from the risk of contracting syphilis in a Barcelona brothel on Carrer d'Avignon. Picasso invented a new emotive vocabulary of a fragmentation and distortion. He broke out of the Western mimetic tradition by including elements appropriated from tribal art. Calling this his first exorcism picture, he intended for the masks to act as, quote, intercessions against everything, against unknown, threatening spirits, end quote. As such, it is as much of a psychological and emotional self-portrait as Kirchner's. The artist is the subject of the painting, even though we can't see him. Portraiture was an important part of George Bellows' work as well. Just over a quarter of the 1,000 works he produced in his short 20-year career are portraits of his parents, his wife, his daughters, his closest friends, and neighbors. Here we see his mother Anna, his Aunt Fanny, and his youngest daughter Jean. Anna and Jean, the oldest and the youngest members of the artist's family, appear to be lost in thought. Fanny looks right at him, while she gestures to the illustration of a still life painting in the book about to slide off of Jean's lap. When Bellows was a boy, his aunt was the only family member who encouraged his art. So we can understand the three women as marking important points of his personal and professional identities: his parent, his child, and his first mentor. Bellows said, "A picture is a human document of the artist," which suggests to me that he might have agreed with my seeing these two paintings as self-portraits. Stylistically, Bellows is a generation or two behind Picasso, trying to be an American old master while Europe is exploding with radical innovation. To quote him again, "The only true modern movement is the frank expression of self. Those who express even a little of themselves never become old-fashioned." Both artists convey a frank expression of self by painting figures of women. Picasso's is historically groundbreaking, an icon of modern art, but in my opinion, self-centered and misogynistic. Bellows's is stylistically traditional, but mature, generous, and respectful. When I was thinking about the Pantheon as an enduring but outdated model of civic architecture, I wondered whether the style of government buildings really mattered. After all, as their audience, we experience politicians through television and the internet, not in their offices. But when it comes to civic sculpture, I have no doubts about its current relevance. Here are two equestrian monuments to Civil War generals, Sherman and Lee. The present chaos in our society pushes the art of the past right into the present. Whether we identify with one region of patronage or another, whether we agree with one part of the audience or another, we can't deny that public art can still stimulate intense public feeling. Like Thomas Jefferson and the architects of our national and state capitals, Augustus St. Gaudens worked within the classical tradition. The winged Victory holding the palm branch, the laurel wreath on Sherman's head, even the basic form of the heroic equestrian statue, all refer to ancient Greek and Roman precedents. His Adams Memorial is free of classical trappings because he was working to the specifications of an enlightened patron. Henry Adams, a Japanophile deeply involved in Buddhist studies, asked St. Gaudens to study the statues of Guan Yin, the goddess of compassion, in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Adams wanted the sculptor to capture a sense of detached serenity in his memorial to his wife, probably because of the violent circumstances of her death. I show it as an example of private rather than public commemoration, because the combination of the two, private and public, is what makes Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial so successful. In 1979, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund started raising private money for a memorial, not to the war they served in, and not to the government that sent them, but to the veterans themselves. 2 years later, it opened a juried competition with 4 criteria. The design had to be reflective and contemplative in character. It had to harmonize with its surroundings. It had to display the names of all those killed, missing in action, or still prisoners of war, and it had to be free of political statement. More than 1,400 entries were submitted anonymously, and the jury unanimously selected a 21-year-old Chinese-American female student. Even though Lin's wall is extremely minimal, descending the long, gradual slope towards its vertex, for me, is as powerful a spatial experience as walking into the Pantheon, as much a descent into the underworld as the other is an entry into heaven. Although veterans groups like the American Legion approved of the winning design, many individual veterans did not. To one, it was a black gash of shame and sorrow, and to another, it was more like a memorial to Jane Fonda than to the Vietnam veterans. President Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, refused to grant permission to build on government land unless the Memorial Fund allowed the second place entry, a figurative bronze grouping of 3 soldiers, to be added. The fund successfully countered with a request that the soldiers be placed so that they looked towards the wall. This adjustment drew the statues into the wall's field of influence and established an experiential unity out of competing agendas. Some years later, a women's veteran group added their own memorial to the nurses who cared for the soldiers in the war. At the time, I felt that the statues were a violation of Lin's design. She, however, was more generous and farsighted, as artists often are. She said, quote, "In a funny sense, the compromise brings the memorial closer to the truth. What is also memorialized is that people still cannot resolve this war." The elements of Lin's design, the reflective black marble and the open path, the density of the inscriptions and the total lack of constraint upon visitors, allow for private mourning in a public space. It is inclusive rather than demonstrative. She has invented a new vocabulary for civic sculpture, modernist rather than classical, and it is now the style of choice for our public memorials to catastrophe. In the very bottom of this slide, just right of center, is the name of one of our classmates, Howie Kestenbaum. Jenny Holzer is as cynical as Hans Christian Andersen, and equally perceptive about human behavior. Society will always be susceptible to influence from above, and who is above will always be determined in part by money. Counter to that influence, we have art. Not the art world, not the art market, not art history, but the raw material, the human documents that artists produce. Bellows' truth tells me that my template is a useful but superficial construct beneath which lies something more profound. The artist operates apart from the social relationship. Creating what Bellows called a frank expression of self is a solitary activity. To be sure, artists will always interact with patrons and audiences. It's a system that works, but only for the minority of artists who are chosen or otherwise make their way into the system. The vast majority of artists outside the system will continue to create regardless of recognition, regardless of acceptance and status, regardless of commercial success or failure, regardless of social impact. Their independence, determination, and contributions are, in my opinion, significant to our understanding of my topic. Significant, but largely undernoticed and underutilized. Despite the determined efforts of teachers and curators at schools and museums like the ones we have here at Williams, who are constantly expanding the scope of their inquiry and outreach. Early on in this talk, I mentioned that the history of the relationship between artist, patron, and audience generally moves towards expansion and integration. I believe that this movement is accelerating and will continue to do so as data science and digital communication become ever more powerful, sophisticated, and embedded in our lives. You're all familiar with how services like Pandora and Spotify provide us with previously unimagined access and control of a limitless supply of recorded music. I can imagine an analogous disruption of the art world, some vast, highly intelligent recommendation engine which shows us art that speaks uniquely to us and then links us directly to the artists who are creating it. A massive compression of artist, patron, and audience that I sense is already underway. Perhaps this will become clear to us between now and our next reunion. Thank you very much.